All right. Welcome back to the Clinical Athlete Podcast. If you're not familiar with Clinical Athlete, we're a network of healthcare providers, students, and coaches who specialize in the management of athletes. You can find your nearest clinical athlete provider at clinicalathlete.com. We also have a forum where clinicians, students, and coaches network, discuss, share ideas and resources related to sports med, athlete rehab, and performance. So to join the forum or for a potential listing on the Clinical Athlete directory and for all upcoming seminars, webinars, Con Ed courses, details can be found on the website. And this podcast can also be found on the website along with YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. My name is Quinn Hennick. I'm a doctor of physical therapy in Orange County, California at Clinical Athlete Newport. And I'm joined by Jared Maynard, who is the Clinical Athlete Continuing Education Director, Coordinator, and a physiotherapist himself at King Physiotherapy and Foot Clinic in Ontario, Canada. Jared, what's up, man?
Not much, man. Excited to be here as always.
Hey, he's also Jared's also a certified strength and conditioning specialist and runs an online powerlifting coaching company and is a competitive lifter himself. So he's walking the walk. And we are extremely excited to welcome to the show Dr. Mike Reiman, who is a faculty member at Duke University, a clinical researcher and educator, and who's done a mountain of research across a wide array of topics in our field, especially in the study of hip impingement, which he actually has a PhD in, newly minted. And I was fortunate enough to meet Mike at Combined Sections meeting last month, and we're honored to have him on the show. So, Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you guys for asking.
Oh, it's truly an honor. And can you tell our 6 listeners a little bit about yourself and what's led you to your research tracks and current interest in the field and ultimately to the pinnacle of your professional career now being on the Clinical Athlete Podcast?
Yeah, hopefully I don't lose you guys some listeners. So I've been, you can tell by my gray hair, I've been around for a while. And so I was a practicing clinician for quite a while, and actually a practicing clinician longer than I've been in academia, which I think is helpful for me. And then kind of getting into academia was kind of by chance. I mean, they needed somebody to teach a couple classes, and I did it, and I enjoyed it. And then just kind of being on both sides of the fence, so to speak, just kind of led to more questions. And luckily, being in academia, I had opportunities to investigate some of those kinds of things. And so, and then just, as opportunities arose, I ended up starting a PhD. I'm very late in my career. I would not suggest that if you're going for a PhD. I would suggest doing that much earlier than I did. And so it's kind of led me to, I've always had an interest in FAI. And then actually what led me to FAI specifically is I was actually in the Midwest and I had this patient that had what I thought was impingement, but at that time, the closest surgeon was like 9 hours away. And so it was like, do I send this person 9 hours away for what I think is going on? And so it kind of led me to do some research and found out there was nothing there. And so it's just kind of how it kind of morphed into where I am today. So.
Would you say that, I know you mentioned the late PhD, but would you say that a lot of the work was done? I mean, you had so much research kind of leading up to when you decided to get that. It's like, well, at least I'll just write a thesis on it.
You know what, actually, so it was interesting is, so I was in the Midwest and I was teaching in the Midwest and we came to Duke in part for me to pursue a PhD. And then I kind of got, so this was like, I didn't really do a good job of planning this out. So like I got here and pretty much every opportunity at that time was, yeah, you can do that, but you're going to have to go down to 25% teaching and no benefits and enroll in a PhD. And so I have a family, I have 2 kids, I have a wife. That was not plausible. And so I just kind of kept doing what I was doing and actually had an opportunity to speak in Doha, Qatar, and Christian Thorberg and Per Holmick came up to me and said, "You're doing some really good stuff. Why don't you just do a PhD?" And so that's pretty much how it happened.
There you go. Yeah. And I know I had mentioned the work you've done on FAI and hip impingement, but you've also had your hand in a fair bit of return to play stuff in various populations lately. And that's what we wanted to get you on the show for, was discussing the current issues we face in regards to return to play, both clinically and in terms of research and creating some high-level evidence to draw from. So in one of your papers, which we'll probably discuss a few on this episode, but this one is you're the lead author on, and it's titled Femoral Acetabular Impingement Surgery Allows 74% of athletes to return to the same competitive level of sport participation, but their level of performance remains unreported, a systematic review and meta-analysis. You highlight a lot of issues in terms of return to sport reporting in this paper. But before that, can you talk a little bit about some of the key elements that define return to sport? In other words, what does a quote-unquote successful return to sport actually mean?
Yeah, so that's like the $1 million question, right? And so I think it's tough because kind of doing some of this research and that kind of stuff, you kind of figure out, part of it is even terminology. What is, what's return to sport? Because in some of these studies, and so I've done a few of these now, but some of these people return to sport by definition because now they're on the roster, and they might not even be playing. And so, like we did one on Tommy John, and does that mean they go back? Did they start at AA and now are they back at AA? And so it's like it became very frustrating, quite honestly, because especially when we did the Tommy John paper, is because we were, well, are they actually better, right? Are they actually better than they were? And so it kind of gets into the testing component, and I think and it kind of gets into there's been a couple of papers out, and maybe kind of go back, and I'm not sure if this is where you're going, but like Sierra Berge is a colleague, and we just published a paper in British Journal of Sports Medicine looking at, okay, what are people doing to determine return to sport? And we had like 209 articles in there. And essentially what it came down to was time. 85% of the studies that are published show that it was time. And then we thought, okay, well, maybe those are just old studies. And so then we look at them, and there's a nice graph in this paper, and it kind of shows over time. Time is still the major component for determination of whether somebody goes back to sport for an ACL. And this was all on ACLs. And it's slightly improved, but, like we're really we're not doing a good job of what I tell students is in picking low-hanging fruit. Like we're not doing a good job of testing strength. We're not doing a good job of testing range of motion, laxity, all these kinds of things. And there's been another study that kind of looked at this too. Greenberg in JOSPT looked at, they did a survey and they asked PTs, what are you guys doing for a return to sport? How do you determine return to sport? And I think it was only, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was only like 55% of people actually did something specifically to determine return to sport. They actually did return to sport battery testing. And so I think that's the biggest problem is, and I know you guys had a webinar on psychosocial issues, and that's a huge thing. But my point is, like, we're not even doing the basics well. And I think probably could argue that is the basics. Psychosocial issues are the basics, but like we're not even doing things that we've known since the 80s. Well, we're not testing strength well. We're not testing range of motion. We're not even doing hop testing. And so I think that's a huge issue. I think the other issue is, are we actually getting our athletes ready to return to sport, right? And so, there's been some other studies kind of showing at 6 months, these people, their limb symmetry indexes and their quad strength and their quad index and their quad force development is really very poor. And so, and I think that comes on rehab. Are we getting them ready? Are they having too much pain? All those kinds of things. And then I think the last issue is, are the tests truly discriminatory? Are the hop tests discriminatory? Are the tests that we're doing, are they the right battery of tests? Because, Matt Itherbren just published a study recently, and we published a study on, Justin Lascali published a study and showed, and I know there's been some people that have had some issues with the Lascali article, but our point in that study was to show that just because somebody passed the test doesn't mean they're ready to go back to sport, right? And so just because they actually meet 90% limb symmetry index doesn't mean they're ready. And so, and I know I'm throwing a lot of information out here, but So like I went to a sports medicine grand rounds this morning, and one of my colleagues, he looked at a couple different things. So they're looking at 6 to 18-year-old kids, and they're looking at what are normative values for HOP tests. What are normative values for different kinds of tests? And so, his name is Jack McGill, and he worked with a cool surgeon named John Rebo. And so they're trying to look at, they work in pediatric ACLs, but they want to get normative values first. And so they're looking at HOP tests, they're looking at Bosio board squats, they're looking at, timed tests, a whole bunch of different tests. And with the understanding is, okay, what are normative values? How many are people actually meeting 90% limb symmetry index side to side? And they put down this parameter of, okay, if 80% of people are meeting limb symmetry index, we'll consider that a valid thing on these different tests. None of those tests were met at 80% value, meaning limb symmetry index was not at 90% or greater on 80% on any of these individuals on these tests. And so I think we think that limb symmetry index is the answer. I think it's actually not the answer. I don't know if I necessarily have a good alternative, but if you have 2 flat tires, you have 2 crappy, you have not very good strength on either leg. Does that mean that you have a good thing? And so like Itherburn looked at, what he found is absolute strength was kind of what discriminated some people from not tearing a second ACL to those that didn't. And so maybe it's, are people just really strong and are they really good versus like comparing side to side, or, there's other things that people look at, like, measuring strength before they have surgery and then comparing that, like Epic or whatever. But, I think we need to recognize that as somebody goes through rehab, is they actually lose strength on their good leg too. And so I think that's why, maybe BFR is a really good thing. Using neuromuscular stim is a good thing. I think we just need to recognize there's limitations on return to sport testing.
Well, with that said, so you mentioned the Lascali paper that you're an author on, and the title of that paper is The Association Between Passing Return to Sport Criteria and Second ACL Injury Risk, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. I've got it right in front of me, by the way. I don't have these things off the top of my head. Okay. Just so people don't think I'm some encyclopedia. Yeah. But, with the conclusions of that study, passing and return to sport criteria didn't show a significant association with a risk of second ACL injury. But back to the Peters, the Berge article, we're using time, it seems like, mostly as a return to sport criteria. So are we even implementing this battery of return to sport testing to be able to say that it's not, it's not predictive?
No, that's right. And so, that's an excellent point. Are the tests the right test? The problem is we're not even doing the test, right? And Greenberg showed that. Sierra Berge's study showed that. The time was the primary issue or primary criteria, which, you need a certain amount of time too, right? You want to make sure that somebody is out far enough, and that's important. And the problem with what we found in that same study is only 13% of the 209 studies showed that people waited 9 months or greater. And so, whatever 100 months, so 87% of them were returning people back to sport less than 9 months. And, if you look at other studies, that shows that that's probably not what we need to be doing. You look at Tim Hewitt, the ACL rock star. He came out with this paper suggesting maybe we wait 2 years because of ligamentization and nociception. And, I don't think anybody will ever do that, but I think he has a good point in the fact that it takes time for the knee joint to heal. So time is very important. And we don't want to be, minimize that, but that's the low hanging fruit, right? I mean, you got to do other things too. You got to do hop testing, and so it's like you're right. We don't know if those are appropriately valid until we have everybody do them, right, and figure out if those are the. I mean, we need to have them, people do them and figure out, okay, yeah, they're the criteria. They're not the criteria.
And just for the listeners, the Berge article, that which you're an author on as well, is titled "Which Criteria Are Used to Clear Patients to Return to Sport After Primary ACL Reconstruction, a Scoping Review." And your point, when you say time was the most common criteria, that means that a lot of clinicians were simply using the time after surgery to determine if the athlete is ready to go back. And then you take that point even further and say, and a lot of them are going back before 9 months. So not only are they not really using a battery of testing, they're probably going back too early anyway, and also not determining whether they're strong enough or rate of force is there, and these types of things. So not great.
No. I mean, it's we were actually, I was pretty surprised. I mean, I kind of suspected some of that. I knew it was going to be kind of all over the place, so like not everybody uses the same limb symmetry index. Some people use manual muscle testing. I knew that kind of stuff was going to happen, but I was actually quite surprised that time was the primary variable, and in that it was less than 9 months. And so, that was, it's, like, maybe I'm spoiled where I'm at, but that's not the norm. And, but it's, we definitely need to improve, I think. So
going back to, we kind of have two things going on here. It's reporting return to sport and what we're actually doing clinically as testing for return to sport. We go back to your hip paper. You talk about things that we should be looking at in terms of reporting return to sport. So return to sport as a general concept is pretty vague. And in a lot of papers, return to sport is synonymous with the return to prior level. It's synonymous with whatever performance. It's just simply return to sport. Did they get back to being on the team or being at the level or in any capacity, really? But in your papers, in the hip paper and the Tommy John's paper, you guys distinguish between returning to sport in any capacity, returning to pre-injury level of sport, and also the importance of determining if their performance was back to pre-injury level or not. So those are three things to look at that a lot of return to sport data is not really looking at. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of making those distinctions as we try to, get better at this whole thing?
Yeah. So it is difficult because so Scott Peters was the lead author on the Tommy John one, and he actually he works in the Major League Baseball, and so it was very helpful to have him on this paper because he goes, okay, here's what's important to me. I mean, working in baseball, I need to know, can they perform? And so, like, as we're going through them, you look at the papers on the surface, and like the majority of them show that 90% of people after a Tommy John or an FAI surgery get back to the sport. But it doesn't tell you, are they performing at the same level? So are they at AAA, AA, single A? But then actually, even more importantly is, now what is their ERA? What is their, wins, WAR, wins above replacement? What is their, are they scoring the same number of goals? Are they, all those kinds of things. Because that's honestly, that's why the athlete has the surgery, right? Is to get rid of the pain, but also so that they can get back to the sport and participate. And it was very bad. Well, it was very poorly reported in the FAI paper because, to be fair and to be honest, FAI is kind of the new kid on the block, right? And so it hasn't, actually it's been around since the 20s, but it hasn't been really investigated very thoroughly until here recently. And so in fairness, we're kind of figuring out how to report it, how to do all this kind of stuff. But we have good example. I mean, we need to follow what's done in the ACL and other kinds of things. So the performance level in FAI was hardly ever reported. I mean, it was only reported in a few articles, and what was reported was actually either the same or slightly worse. What was reported in the Tommy John papers was better. What we had a hard time figuring out, though, is kind of what I mentioned before, is, did they leave at were they in AA when they had surgery, and did they go back to AA? So that was very hard to figure out. But there was actually some performance statistics, and it kind of talks in there. I think, ERA was a little bit worse. They didn't pitch as many innings and that kind of stuff, which, part of our reason for wanting to do that paper is because if you look at, social media and the media is, I mean, it's like kids are having their Tommy John replaced because they think they can throw faster, I mean, so it's like, there's actually people that are talking about doing it prophylactically, and we said, what is going on? So we wanted to kind of point out that that's not always the case. And so, and that kind of, we were probably a little bit biased going into it. We were hoping that it showed that, and to our bias, it did show that, they don't get back to, if you look at the majority of studies, Tommy John, FAI, and ACL, you almost always see 90 percentile is kind of what, everybody goes back to the sport. But if you look at actually how, what do they go back to the same previous level prior to surgery? It's almost in the 70 percentiles, except for Claire Arden showed about 55 percentile in ACL. So it's very rare that people go back and perform at the same level that they were prior to their injury and their surgery.
Well, a direct rebuttal to I'll pitch faster if I get Tommy John surgery was that velocity was down. It seemed like in all three of the studies, I think that looked at that, pitching velocity was down. ERA was up in 2 out of the 3. So to your point, it doesn't seem like it's good. Getting them back to it gets them back to sport. But again, now level 2, or we talk about that return to sport in any capacity, return to pre-level. What about a college kid? Pre-level is college. You can't go back to high school. So does that even make it more important to get that performance-based return to sport outcome?
Yeah, and actually that's where we struggle the most. And we, kind of what we decided to do is to kind of, like, if we didn't know where they went, like because, if they go from high school to college, well, they're at a higher level, but they're performing. So we kind of like try to minimize those people. But yeah, it's one of those things where if you're in high school and you have Tommy John so that you can pitch in college, there's so many variables, right? There's so many things that are uncontrollable. And in fairness to the people that are reporting this, is like those are confounding variables, right? And you can't, like, if somebody has Tommy John as a junior, you can't follow them out for 5 years and figure out if they're going to return to the same level because they started in high school, right? And so that does make it difficult. And to some degree, this is always going to be an issue, even if you do, good reporting on these post-surgical kinds of things. And so, that's just the nature of the beast. And there's so many variables that are difficult to control. And somebody might start, other studies have shown that the higher velocities are kind of like risk factors for Tommy John. Maybe they change to a different type of a pitch, right? And so are they at the same level? So there's that's where we kind of started getting in the weeds, and we said, okay, we got to get out of this because it was so messy. But that's the nature of it. And so, those are hard things to control. And those are things that the people that are reporting this should not be penalized for. So.
Yeah, totally. What was interesting, I think, in the HIP paper was a quarter of the athletes after HIP, it was a reconstruction or an arthroscopy open surgery for FAI. A quarter of them did not return to pre-level. but did report largely satisfaction and improvement with patient-reported outcomes. You guys had some interesting thoughts as to why. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? I mean, that kind of stuff just fascinates me, and it's hard to say why, but it's and maybe my bias. So like we all have bias, right? And so I think part of my bias is I think some of it is expectation. I think some of it is people. I mean, we're doing an expectation trial right now, and so it's like and we're doing it on FAI. So we're essentially asking people, so, as a result of this surgery, what do you expect to get back to? And they all expect to get back to normal, 100% what they were. And the studies just don't prove that out. And so it is fascinating in the sense of their pain level had improved, their satisfaction had improved, but they hadn't gone back to the same level. And so, I mean, why is that? And so, so do they kind of get satisfied and say, okay, this is probably as good as it's going to get. I'm probably, this is probably where I'm at. I'm back to sport where I wasn't playing sport before. So, do they actually lower their expectations? And so I think that is some of it. And I think that leads to a question is, do we need to start addressing that, as we have them go through rehab, and probably better for the surgeon is to say, well, just so that 74% of people or whatever it ends up being at that point is, and that's a whole other discussion and kind of thing, but that's something I always struggle with patients is they're going in and they're expecting to go back to sport. And when they fill out that expectation score and it's like 100% is like, oh man, what do I do with this information?
Well, now their expectations will change and they won't care if they're at 100%, 175% will be 100%.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's just one of those where, it's if you think about it, it's probably a few weeks before their surgery. They have their surgery. Now they're 6 to 9 months down the road. And like our expectations in life and those kinds of things change over time. And so maybe it's simply that. Oh,
especially if you're a college kid, a lot happens in a year. That's 6 to 9 months, 6 to 12 months. Maybe you grow up, you find different interests, you get married, Yeah, it's really interesting. The human element just confounds everything. Just makes it so complicated.
It's so fascinating. And it's just like one of those where it's like, I did this talk and it was a talk right after my defense and it essentially kind of got to the point of, does it do any good to do all these tests and those kind of stuff versus like looking at things like prognosis and actually contextual factors in the makeup of the patient, and because it's like, I think that is hugely important on prognosis. And we know from other studies, and I know that's not what we're talking about today, but like depression, expectation, mental health, comorbidities, those all worsen after FAI surgery. And so, I think it's, like I've tweeted and stuff before. I mean, you got to treat the patient, not the presentation. So,
speaking of the return to sport criteria, we've got our battery of tests with ACLs. We've already kind of talked about how it's not perfect and maybe not as predictive as we'd like it to be, but it's certainly better than nothing. Speaking of nothing, in your hip paper, in regards to return to sport criteria reporting, 0 of the studies in your review actually reported what criteria they used to determine if the athlete was ready to return to sport after hip surgery. So my question to you is, are we not reporting these return to sport criteria because we really don't have any established the way that we do for ACL? Or is that just a lazy oversight? What's going on with that?
Yeah, I think it's probably multifactorial, honestly. I mean, I think it's both of those things that, well, I don't know, I don't think laziness, but I do think that we do not have published standards for hip like we do for ACL. And so I mean, if you look at, there's been a couple of studies on this that kind of show if you look at post-operative protocols, and they're all over the place for FAI and labral, and I remember we're getting ready to publish another paper on it. I mean, it's terrible, quite honestly, and so which is difficult because it doesn't give a clinician guidance on what to do for those kinds of things, and so return to sport testing is an issue for FAI and labral and hip in general because nobody's really, I mean, people are working on it. And so, I mean, part of it's new. Part of it is not laziness in reporting it. Part of it is probably maybe not thinking it's important to report or in fairness too, some journals limit what you can report. But that's why there's things called appendices. And so those are online kinds of things where, I mean, you can put it in there, but we don't do a good job of reporting it. And it's, part of it is because it's all over the place, and part of it is because the reporting is not thought to be important, and or journals kind of limit it, or I mean, there's probably multiple reasons.
Is that kind of a disconnect between research and clinical practice? Because as a clinician,
yeah,
that's kind of what your eyes is starting to go to, and it's like, well, what do I actually do with this person when they're in front of me to determine whether they go back or not? It's tough.
No, it is. And I mean, that's honestly a fair point. And so like I get caught up myself and like I still practice. I still practice every week and teach and research but I do sometimes catch myself like, okay, I'm in the clinic. I kind of think, I mean, it's hard to think about all of those things at one time. And so like when I'm doing research, I'm trying to ask good research questions, but then it's like I like having clinicians on my studies because they'll say, well, I mean, just exactly what you said is, well, what do I do with that information, right? And so it's like, even though I'm a clinician, it's like I'm not primarily a clinician. And I have research questions, and I have questions that I'm trying to answer from a research and statistical standpoint versus like, oh yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I don't actually know what you do with that information, right? And so I do think there's a disconnect, and I think that there's always going to be somewhat of a natural disconnect. But there are a lot of good researchers that are good at doing that very well, and I think that's a good reason to have clinician research teams, which you're starting to see more and more of, and I think that's hugely important.
Well, I think Mike, that your point there about how there likely will be or continue to be a disconnect on either side probably works the other way around too, where just in my reasonably limited experience, just having practiced around 4 or so years now, I've come across a number of clinicians who just kind of seem very entrenched in what they do, and like, this is what seems to work, and I saw it listed here or this recommendation, so I'm going to be doing it. I think that a lot of us would probably benefit from trying to adopt some of the mental processes of a researcher to ask questions about what we know and how we know it. Where did the information come from? What were the limitations of it? So therefore, how much of this can we take and how can we apply it, and how confidently can we apply it? What questions still exist, and what do we need to be careful about as we work with patients and as we explain narratives to them. So I think that, a lot of us could benefit from that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough though, right? Because I mean, it's like when I'm, I have a great job in the clinic. I don't have to do any documentation. I don't really want to say too much about that. I don't want to make too many people mad. But it's like when I'm in the, I mean, it's like you have a full day and you have document. I mean, it's like you're busy, right? And it's hard. And it's, I mean, I did that for 10, 12 years. And it's not necessarily a grind. I mean, I always still enjoy it, but it's like, I mean, you're focused on getting your notes done so that you're not, up at 8 o'clock at night and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. We do so it's, and we haven't been always good at it, but we do a good job here, especially at our sports clinic where, Jack McGill, who I was talking about before on PEDS ACLs, he's a clinician and he's working he wants to, he's doing research and he's looking to do a PhD and that kind of stuff. But he's on a team. He's on a team with a researcher, with a physician, 2 researchers. And so it's like you got to have a team. There's no way, but hopefully that team is multifaceted, right? Where you have clinician input, you have research input, you have stats input. Like you got to have a statistician on. I mean, to understand, no, you can't do that and that kind of stuff. And so, but he also has a little bit of his time carved out for that, right? And it's, I mean, there's productivity standards and there's all kinds. I mean, so it's like when I do my research, it's primarily on my own time. And at some point, I'm probably going to get tired of doing that, right? And so, I mean, it's difficult as a clinician. I mean, it's just, there's so many things and it's hard. But, I will tell you that researchers typically want clinicians to come to them with questions. Because if nothing else, they can collect the data for them, right? And so then that's a good way to get started, and that's a good way to get in there. And if you are a clinician, go talk to somebody that's doing research and just see how they think, and then it's good for the researcher too, because it's like I have these questions, but like none of these are clinically applicable, right? And so I think it's good to have that symbiotic relationship between clinicians and researchers.
Well, definitely. And one more thing to throw in there, just on top of the time constraints and logistical considerations for clinicians, you also ultimately have a person in front of you saying, this is my problem, what do I do about it? Or what's causing it? And if you want to give perhaps an accurate but ultimately unsexy answer of, well, we don't really know, but this is what we're thinking, that's probably not what the patient was ultimately hoping for. They're wanting a more confident vote of this is what we do, and here's how long it's going to take. And moving forward, but it can be tough to try to uphold, a standard for accuracy, while also trying to meet the patient expectations and still create a confident or put forth a confident game plan to the best of your ability. Provided that everything is within your scope and you're able to do that.
That's always one of the hardest conversations. I mean, it's like, the evidence isn't great for this or whatever. We don't know. I think over time you learn how to say that better, but it's like I still mess up on that, right? And so, and I think it's one of those things where you kind of, I think over time, I don't know if you necessarily get better or you understand that it's not always going to be a win, right? And so maybe you just kind of understand that, this is going to, versus like trying to avoid it altogether and saying, yes, this is the thing to do. And I do think patients overall in general appreciate honesty, and part of that is figuring out how to speak that message, and it's different for everybody.
Mike, you mentioned talking about prognostic factors maybe being more beneficial than diagnostic factors, and with the hip specifically, do you think that part of this is that we just don't have a great diagnostic framework for FAI impingement? I've seen the occurrence of this surgery just kind of blow up over the past 10 years. And it's almost like, all right, we're doing this procedure now. And then we're like, okay, whoa, let's figure out how to test for this, or let's figure out some criteria to rehab, because apparently it's going to be happening more and more.
Yeah. No, I've written a couple of papers on this, and I think the surgeons think that I'm anti-surgery, and I'm not anti-surgery. I just think it's overutilized to some degree, and so that's the nature of the beast. So practice is always going to be ahead of science, right? So you're always going to see where utilization of clinical practice is ahead of where science is. But it's interesting is we've never been this far ahead, and if you look at the rate of FAI surgery uptake, it's 2,500% increase over like a 7-year period from, I think, 2006 to 2013. So I don't know if those numbers are exact, but that's pretty close. And so, we've never seen this amount of growth. With growth comes painful problems, right? And those kinds of things. And even when I defended my thesis, I don't know if I should say this. When I defended my thesis, I pretty strongly said, Fader's test example is a good screening test. It is not a good screening test, because if you look at how so what's nice about it is it does decrease probability by 34%, but the confidence interval of that is anywhere from 5% to 95%. So essentially is they could, I mean, it, you know, don't want to get into sensitivity and specificity, but it, like your odds could be worse as a result of that. And, you know, and part of the issue is it's done in settings of high probability and that kind of stuff. But if you work in a surgeon's office, you might as well not even do the test because it's not really going to, I mean, it can maybe help exclude some other kinds of things, but yeah, I mean, I think that's the nature of it. You know, I do think, I think we can improve on our diagnostic accuracy studies, but, you know, I do think prognosis is important because, you know, like if you look at the shoulder, you look at other areas that have been done for a period of time, there aren't that really very many good tests that I would hang my hat on. And so it's like maybe we need to look at prognostic factors instead of, you know, like special tests, which are typically not very special. So.
They're not allowed to take a PhD away from you, are they?
All right, I got one.
Yeah.
I mean, I did say that on there, but in kind of explain that. So, but it's I was hesitant. I mean, that's what the evidence shows, right? And so I just had to make sure I had a good defense for it.
Yeah. Well, it makes perfect sense. I mean, really, just these tests clinically. Somebody comes in with hip pain. As a clinician, you already know that hip hurts. You're kind of biased to just, you know, hey, you know, you jam that hip in that position. Hey, you know, how does that feel? And you're already kind of like nodding your head, like, oh yeah, that hurts probably, right? And they're like, oh yeah. You know, so it's really hard to control for that stuff.
And what are you impinging, right? Is it soft tissue? Is it bone? I mean, yeah, who knows? Yeah,
totally. And what's discomfort for somebody is, you know, their pain versus somebody else's is just like, it's a feeling, you know, that whole thing too. When you talk about prognostic factors, let's say ACL, just because of those return to sport criteria a little bit more defined, prognostic factors would be something separate from let's say a battery of tests in the very, very beginning.
Yeah. So like a good example, maybe an example in the ACL would be, you know, like what the Delaware group is doing, looking at copers versus non-copers. And so looking at, okay, who probably needs surgery. So like as a clinician and a researcher, like when a patient comes into me with FAIs, I want to try to figure out okay, what's the odds of this person avoiding surgery, right? And because, part of the problem is they come in, they expect to have surgery. So that's part of the issue that maybe goes into the prognostic factor thing. But like we know, we've already done some of the work, right? And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Look at it like what Delaware has done. And, you know, there's certain people that can cope with without an ACL. You know, they probably can't do transverse plane kinds of things. They're probably a little bit older. I mean, some of those kinds of variables. And so, and I honestly think that because I know that some people are looking at this, like you're going to start seeing more of this kind of stuff, you know, in other areas of the body and kind of looking at, okay, you know, this patient comes in, you know, are they a surgical candidate? You know, it's like, well, if you look at meniscectomies, I mean, we know that if they have degenerative meniscus tears, they're probably not as good as surgical candidates if they have mechanical symptoms. If they have locking and catching and that kind, I mean, that's probably a good surgical candidate versus, you know, somebody with degenerative tear that just kind of hurts and no, you know, kind of insidious onset kind of thing.
Lots to do. What's down the pipeline for you? Are you going to fix all this?
Well, I want to try to contribute, but I would like to look at some of those prognostic kinds of things. And so, but that's unfortunately, that's probably going to take a while. But yeah, I mean, looking at that kind of stuff, and you know, it's and maybe the bigger kind of thing is kind of look at the expectation kind of thing, and just seeing if is that something that we can try to address or not.
And you've got that coming down. You said for the hip, potentially.
Yeah,
right?
we're looking at we're looking at it for the hip. The problem is we're having a hard time getting people to enroll because I mean, imagine you were this. I mean, I would think I would do the same thing. Is if I saw my MRI and I saw my X-ray and I saw a bone that was larger than reported as normal, I was larger than my other side, and I saw a tear in my labrum, I'm going to probably ask, why am I going to PT?
And it hurt, and it hurts right there.
Right. And I mean, that's how subacromial decompression started, right? They saw the type 3 acromion hanging down, and it's like, well, yeah, it's right below it's right above the rotator cuff. Yeah, I can see how that would, tear over time. And so, it's tough. I mean, it's hard to well, here's the kicker is like, I can't convince them that, yeah, if you give me 6 weeks, I can guarantee you're going to be better. Right. Because we can't do that. And in full disclosure, our non-surgical rehab for FAI is not very good in the literature. And so it's a tough sell, and luckily I have enough people that are on a waiting list that I can say, well, you don't have surgery for 6 weeks anyway. Why not come see me? So.
And can we expect more, not necessarily from you, but perhaps from you or your team or others, more specific return to sport criteria and batteries of tests for FAI impingement surgeries?
Yeah. What was interesting is, over in Europe, it's called the over in Warwick, Europe, or Warwick, United Kingdom. They had a bunch of us get together and try to come up with just even a protocol on post surgery, and we had people from all over the world, and the point I'm trying to make is the agreement was low, and so. But we did kind of come up with some general kinds of things, and hopefully that kind of gets some traction, that kind of stuff. I think the problem there, Quinn, is like if you standardize it, it doesn't allow for individuality, right? And it doesn't allow for patient comes in and they have a lot of comorbidities, and well, if you have Adrian Peterson come in versus almost anybody else, right? I mean, how would you, Derek Rose, right? I mean, 2 elite level athletes, you would think that you could probably rehab them the same, but obviously that was not done, right? And for whatever reasons. So I think it's going to be tough. I think there's going to be some baseline kind of stuff, but then after that, it's going to, and it should be, right? It should be individualized. It should be monitored to the patient.
Do you think that's one of the issues with the ACL criteria is that it's too standardized, or is that more of an individualized the way that you're referring to?
Yeah, well, I think, I can only speak from stuff that we've done, right? So the Berge article and that kind of, I think what we need to do is we need to have everybody do something, right? And figure out what works, right? I mean, the problem is right now, not everybody's doing something. I mean, we're just waiting on time. And so it's very hard to say, well, hop testing doesn't work or what. I mean, when not everybody's doing it, right? And so if we get to the point where everybody's doing it and we have a baseline, then we can kind of try to discriminate, variables that are discriminatory versus those that are not discriminatory. And so, that was, the biggest point of the Berge article to me is, like, guys, we need to at least do this and figure out what's good and what's not as good.
Jared and I were actually discussing a little bit briefly before this, the Scally article, and we could see how some younger, students, young clinicians, and across the board would read that and say, well, return to sport testing doesn't predict anything. What do we do? What do we even do? But I think what you may have just answered that. And my question to you is going to be, you teach students at Duke and you present them with all of this uncertainty. They're going to go to the clinic at some point very soon and have this person in front of them. In their mind, they're like, we don't know anything, but they still have to do something. What is your general advice for the new grad, young clinician with all of this uncertainty surrounding these things?
Yeah, that's like, we talk about that almost every day. And so it's, like I teach them a specific format on the exam. It's what I call the funnel, and it's like interview, observation. I mean, different things and essentially is you're trying to go through the ICF model and figure out, okay, what are the impairments? What are the contextual factors? What are the psychosocial issues? And so what are the things that are in this individual person in front of you that you think are contributing to what their issue is, right? And so, if you take Adrian Peterson and Derek Rose, Adrian Peterson just he needed time, he needed to get stronger, right? And Derek Rose had other issues. And so I think, so the exam is still really, really important because it kind of guides you in, okay, what things do I need to address? So there's really nice things out there like OSPRO and other kinds of screening things to see if somebody has psychosocial issues. If they have those issues, then you need to address those. If it's somebody that just needs to get stronger, you'll focus on the strength and the power and all those kinds of things. That makes it sound very easy though, right? But I think part of figuring that out is having good tools, and making sure you're testing strength, maybe you're testing range of motion, you're doing the test, you're looking at contextual factors, and then you try to design a program based on the things that you found. And, just kind of one quick thing on the Lascali article is, there's some good study. Greendom is a very nice study. Christus is a very nice study. Those are really, really good studies. And part of the issue in full disclosure is, we combined different criteria, so that made it heterogeneous. There are still good guidelines, and I would still look at Greendom. I would still look at Christus, probably mispronouncing that. But those are still good guidelines to do. The point I wanted to kind of make with that article is just because they passed doesn't mean they're a green light. And so to me, that's the message of that paper.
And just because it's not as predictive as we'd like doesn't mean you don't do the testing.
Right.
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 Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent point. Yes.
And I think in the Berge article, even though you guys aren't necessarily, well, you kind of are looking at that, the Berge article has some great starting points to testing, and it can lead people down. There's other references there that you can cross-reference and start to learn about that stuff.
So if people have that article, I would highly suggest that they read the discussion. I did not write it. Claire Arden wrote it. It's excellent. Claire Arden is a rock star with ACLs, and it's a beautiful discussion. She talks about, waiting at least 9 months, looking at different contextual factors. It's extremely well written. She did a great job.
Mike, when your new stuff starts coming out, I'm going to put you on the spot. Would you be willing to come back on the show and talk about it?
I would love to.
Boom. Jared, you heard that.
I did.
Everybody heard it. Can't take it back now. Where can people find you?
So I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I might mess these up, but I think it's like Reiman. So it's like REIMAN.Michael actually, I don't even know my handles. I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram. My email is reiman.michael@gmail.com. I think it's at Mike Reiman for Instagram and at Mike. I honestly don't.
Yeah, you got no. I do that. It is Michael Reiman and on Instagram, so it's super easy. And I would say, everyone, give Instagram. You've been doing a great job with that of very succinct posts, putting all the main points of an article kind of in the infographic, and then main points in the caption. But then obviously, you're just spurring discussion. And
yeah, that's it's honestly, where it's doing the PhD was so enlightening. I had two people that were smarter than me about topics, and just why are you doing that? What do you think? No, you can't do. It's like you grow exponentially when you have people ask you those kinds of questions, and not that you need somebody to badger you, but you need to, I think I posted on this on one of the Instagram things, but you need to be around people that will ask you and will question you. right? And I mean, if you're around people that believe the same things, there's no chance for growth, and you will probably all have the same kinds of thoughts. And you'll say, yeah, it's, we're doing the right thing. And so the one nice thing about social media is, for me at least, is it makes me look at, awesome people like Scott Morrison, Rich Willie. Just like, oh man, that's, like Scott posted something today, was like, his quad index thing is like, that's brilliant. Right. And it's like I've been calculating it out. And so it's, there's a lot of smart people out there, and it's good to follow those people and ask them questions.
And that's coming from a guy who had plenty of skin in the game before you went PhD route, and you were kind of back into it. Oh wow, getting,
it's pretty humbling.
Yeah. That's really, really great, Mike. This has been awesome. Thanks so much for being on the show. We really, really appreciate it, and we look forward to looking for future work from you.
Thanks, guys. Loved it.